Hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. I hope everyone's doing well. I hope everyone's enjoying their summer. So this week I'm going to be doing part 2 of the Temperament series. You can find part 1. I'll probably link it below. I might add a card on the screen. So yeah, if you want to watch part 1, you can go ahead and watch that. I'm just going to do a little recap from part 1. So, if you don't really feel like going to watch that video, you can just listen here. So the 4 temperaments, we have choleric, melancholy, sanguine, and phlegmatic. So there's four temperaments: choleric, sanguine, melancholy, and phlegmatic. And the main point I made in the last video is that the 4 temperaments are not, in fact, personality traits, which is something that is commonly misunderstood. So in this part, what I'm going to try to describe is how everyone's temperament is disordered, and just kind of look a little bit more into what exactly these temperaments are and how exactly they function. So again, just recap from last time, what your temperament actually is, again, it's not your personality, but what it actually is the strength of impressions you have in the short term and long term. Okay, so you could have a strong or a weak impression, and you could have a strong or weak impression in the short term or in the long term. Okay, so if you do the math on that'll give you 4 different ways of interacting with the world. And we do know this. We can look just at different people, and we can discover just by looking at different people and how they react to things, that there are different strengths of impressions people have. When we say impression, just as a quick recap, what we really mean is a person's emotional response to something, or their emotion, not their emotional understanding, the strength of their response. That's what we mean by impression, of their emotional response. So we don't mean necessarily that they start yelling or whatever, if something negative happens. I mean, that could be something they do because they have a strong negative emotional impression of something. But that is not necessarily what we mean. We mean we generally mean a person's emotional response to something. Now, by impression, we could mean a little bit more than that, but let's just stick with that for now. The strength of impression, what we mean is just the strength of their emotional response, right? And when we say short-term and long-term, we mean, what is somebody's impression of something in the short term and what is it in the long term? So as an example, you may know people who things happen within the moment and they don't seem to be that bothered by it. And then later on, they're very bothered by it, right? And so that's actually an example of a person with a melancholy temperament. So an example of a person with a phlegmatic temperament is somebody who has weak impressions in both the short term and the long term. So let's say somebody who just nothing really seems to faze them. That could be an example of a phlegmatic person. An example of a choleric person is somebody with a strong impression in both the short and long term. An example of somebody like that would be somebody who's just very, again, they get mad at something in the present and they continue to be just as mad about it. And I'm using the negative examples because those seem to stick out a little bit. And then, so phlegmatic, I did the melancholy, phlegmatic, and choleric. And then the last one is the sanguine. That's the person who has a very strong impression in the short term, but a weaker impression in the longer term. An example of somebody like that would be the person who might just, snap in the short term. You say one thing, they blow a gasket, and then 5 minutes later, it's like nothing happened, right? So that would be an example of somebody who may be sanguine. Again, these are the generalizations of people like that. And, always remembering that just because somebody doesn't react in a particular way, that doesn't tell you anything about their impressions, right? Because people do not have to react according to their emotional responses. We just generally tend to think that people who react stronger tend to have stronger emotional responses to things. And again, just as an example of how we know that there are difference in strengths of impression, just think of, somebody who, when you tell a joke, like, it doesn't really seem to matter how funny it is. If they find it a little bit funny, they're laughing really hard in comparison to the person who seems to never really laugh that hard, just kind of like, haha, yeah, that's funny. And so, those would be examples of two different strengths of impression. And again, keeping in mind that just because somebody has a strong strength of an impression or has a strong impression doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to react strongly. Again, generally people do, but some people try to control themselves for whatever reason. Okay, so we do know, this is what I was trying to say in my last video, is we do know for a fact that these temperaments exist, right? Because you're going to either have a weak impression or a strong impression. We know that because of the examples we looked at, right? You're going to have a weak impression in the short term and a weak impression in the long term. And we know that, again, because of the examples we have looked at. Okay, so having explained that, and in the last video I explained why we use why we're only using two different strengths of impression. If you think about it, you could say, well, what if somebody has a really strong impression or a really weak impression? So I go into that in the last video. It's not an exhaustive explanation, but it kind of covers the basic logic of it. So if you want to figure that out, go check out the last video. Now, what we want to look at in this video is like, what exactly is going on with these strengths of impression? Why might people have different strengths of impression in the short term and in the long term? And why do people have different impression strengths? Why is it that one person might find a joke really funny or laugh really hard at a joke, and another person who understands the joke in the exact same way won't laugh as hard? Why, why is that? We're not going to be able to exactly answer that, but we can start getting close here. Okay, so first of all, what we need to realize is that when we say strength of impression, we do not mean the speed at which a person processes information, right? So if you tell a joke to two people and they both get it and one laughs way harder than the other, we don't mean that the one that's laughing really hard is smarter than the other person, right? So because processing, the speed in which you process information is actually intelligence. And so it might seem, the person who has weak impression in the short term and a strong impression in the long term, that person's, the melancholy person is just less intelligent. That's actually not what we mean. We mean something more like an emotional response. So I've said that before. Yeah, and so does this have to do with cognitive abilities? No, I already answered that question, but it does in the sense that like your emotional response is dependent on your understanding of a situation, but not the strength of your emotional response necessarily. So, somebody who's really smart isn't necessarily going to have strong emotional reactions to things, right? I mean, they might, but not necessarily. So we don't mean intelligence. Let's just get that out of the way. But somebody who is smarter than another person might be able to better understand things quicker, right? They might be able to understand the emotional significance of an event quicker. And then you could get into emotional intelligence and everything like that. I don't know a whole lot about emotional intelligence and whether this would apply, but, generally, we say that people who are faster at processing information are more intelligent. So, yeah, so all other things being equal, an intelligent person may understand a joke more fully while laughing less than the intelligent or the less intelligent person who understood the joke less, right? So if you're smarter, generally speaking, all things being equal compared to another person who is not as smart as you, you're going to understand jokes better and quicker than that person, just because you're more intelligent. You process the information quicker. But that doesn't mean that you're going to laugh harder at the joke, right? Because, yeah. So thus, before we have an impression, we mentally process an event to understand its meaning, right? And, this is done on many different levels in the human. We do it more than just the conscious level. So we mentally process the event to understand its meaning, and from the vague meanings we have an emotional response. So there's the event, we see the event, we process the event, and then based off of how we've processed the event, the understanding of the event, we then have an emotional response to that understanding. Okay, and that emotional response is our what we mean when we say our temperament. It's the strength of that emotional response based on our processing of the information. So we process the information and go, oh, this is sad. And then there's this other thing that we have that takes that, oh, this is sad, and then we feel sadness and a certain strength of sadness. Okay, so that's what we need to understand there. So is it then that the person with weak impressions has a more vague understanding of the meanings of the event? Is that a way of describing what's happening? So is the person who has weaker impressions just has a vaguer understanding of the event that happened? Well, no, because to have a clearer understanding is to have a truer understanding. So again, that just goes back to intelligence. Right, so if you have a vaguer understanding of an event, that just means that you're probably less intelligent than the person who has a clearer understanding. Again, all things being equal. All things being equal, the 4 different temperament types get the same picture of an event, and that picture produces within them different strengths of emotional impressions. Thus, a person given to impatience will be bothered by running into 3 red lights in a row, no matter his temperament, right? So if you're an impatient person, it doesn't matter what your temperament is, you're still going to be bothered by running into 3 red lights in a row, okay? It's only a matter of how bothered you are by it in comparison to somebody with a different temperament. And again, you could say, oh, well, a more impatient person is going to be more bothered. I mean, like people that are equal in their impatience level will have a different level of being bothered by something. Okay. And so the other thing on that, the weak impressions and the vague understandings, no, because again, that goes back to intelligence, right? So if you have a vague understanding of something, that means you're generally less intelligent than the person who has a clear understanding. All things being equal. Again, all things being equal, right? That's a brief aside. I think I'm going to do a video on intelligence maybe next week if I have time, because I just thought now that, there's a lot of misunderstanding around the different types of intelligence and different levels of intelligence. People generally seem to think that everyone's just as intelligent as everyone else, and that's just not true. And we need to understand that, right? We need to understand that intelligence is a real thing, and we should be generally aware of how intelligent we are, right? So anyway, continuing. One cannot directly control the strength of his impressions, right? I say directly because there might be a way to, Yeah, and again, think about that. Somebody says something to you and you just have an emotional response. Well, in the moment, you don't have a lot of control over the emotions you feel because of that. You might be able to go through some therapy, do some other sort of things to try to change that, but generally speaking, directly in the moment, you don't have control of that. He acts in response to those. He does have control in how he acts in response to those emotional impressions. Okay, so what we're trying to answer here is, why do people have different strengths of impressions? And that's just a point I had under there. Since the impression strength is not cognitive, and I think I've made that point quite clearly, it is physiological, right? So, and again, we know this because we feel emotion in our body. So the strength of the emotion we feel is a physiological thing. And so that's what we mean by temperament. Our cognition gives us an image of the event and something else. And something else, by the nature of its construction, responds to that image. So what I mean by that is, in our minds, we have this cognition of the event. We have the understanding, oh, this is going to be sad, right? And then that our mind gives it to the physiological aspect of us. And based off of that, I lost my train of thought right mid-sentence. And based off of that, of our specific construction, we will have either a strong or a weak impression in the short or long term, right? Okay, so next point. Okay, so actually, this is one last point on this, answering this. The cognition is the input and the impression is the output, right? The cognition inputs something like, this is funny, and the impression, or when I say impression, I mean our physiological construction, outputs the strength of humor felt. And when I say the strength of humor felt, I mean that's a double entendre, obviously. If you know where the terms phlegmatic, sanguine, and all of that come from, it comes from, they're traditionally called the four humors, right? So it's just kind of funny that, it's kind of humorous that when we're responding to the strength of somebody's sense of humor, we actually are referring back to, the original humors, the phlegmatic, the sanguine, and choleric, and everything like that. So if you don't know what I'm talking about there, just never mind. But if you do, it's kind of funny. It's kind of humorous. Haha. Anyway, so so it does not output, this is so the cognition does not necessarily output, this is really, really, really funny, laugh really hard at this. It might output, like, there's a greater degree of humor here, to our physiology, but it doesn't output how hard we are going to laugh. That's part of our physiology. Now, then we have the natural question: why might impression strength change with time? Right? Why might that be? Like, what is it like? If we have this thing, and I know this is a bit complex, but we have our cognition, and then we have this other thing that has the emotional response to our cognition. I'm calling that our physiology. We don't really know what it is. Maybe some people do, but just for now, we'll say we don't really know what that is. We just know that there's this physiological aspect of us that has the emotional response. Now, why does this emotional response, this physiological aspect, have a stronger or weaker impression over time? Why is that? Or how would that be? So there's two ways of looking at this. In one way, you could say that we have the image of the event that happened. And again, that our physiology, it's like something's being put in. Boom, this is the image. This is the cognition of the event. Boom, our physiology grabs it like that. And then it outputs emotional response. It outputs emotion, right? And so why would, because an event happens, and at one point for some people, it outputs a strong emotional response. And at another point, same event, same cognition, boom, grabs it, and it outputs a weaker response. Why is that? So we could say that maybe it's the image is colored differently, or the event, it's like there's something different about it based off the time. And again, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to build a system just for people watching. What we're trying to do is we're trying to like build a system that it would make sense where there's the same kind of input with two different kinds of output. That's kind of what we're trying to answer here. And so, and I know this is a little bit thick. This is a little bit like, it's kind of like molasses that we're trying to pour right now. And so I know that, just bear with me. So we could say that the image is colored differently. The image of the event, which is that the cognition, it's the input. The image of the event is colored differently than the person's colored differently, rather than the person's temperament is such that the change of color does not change the strength of his reaction. Oh, sorry, I skipped ahead. Oh, so yeah, that the images of the events are colored differently or something, and based off that color, that's how our temperaments change. Blah 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 blah. But I don't think that's what's going on, and here's why. So I don't think that, like I said, this temperament grabs it and outputs either soft or weak depending on long or short term. I actually don't think that's what's happening. I think that there's two different aspects to our physiological nature, and one aspect is dealing with the immediate, and one aspect is dealing with the long term, and I'm going to explain why that is. And based off of that, it's actually our mind, our cognition, that inputs the events at different points. Now, events are colored a little bit differently based over time. We know that. But our cognition of events are colored differently based over time, because if something's long in the past, we don't remember it as well, etc., etc. However, if we have just one aspect of our physiological nature that's just doing one sort of output and has one input, what that implies is that you have to have like 4 different types of physiological aspects, right? So you start complicating things. And there's this Occam's razor, which is people misquote Occam's razor, by the way. What Occam's razor is that you should not multiply entities unnecessarily, right? So don't multiply entities unnecessarily. And so what you want to do is when you're trying to come up with things like this, when you're trying to build theories, is you want to build the simplest theory possible while answering all of the questions, right? So if you come up with the simplest theory possible, it's most likely to be true. So with the one that with if you have one physiological nature, if each person has one, that means that there's 4 different types of physiologies. The physiologies actually become more complex. There's more complexity to the physiology. If each person has 2 different types of physiology, that implies that the physiologies are a lot less complex. So again, we're keeping things simple, and so that's why I think that's a better explanation of what's happening there. So the former does not really explain why. And again, that it doesn't explain why the construction will output a different result depending on time. It kind of does, but then that means that we have a very complex physiology, and instead of a simple one, right? Thus, if we are to say that the output is dependent upon the construction, that is our temperament. If our emotional response is dependent upon our temperament, the input must be acted upon by a different construction to have a vastly different output, right? So if we're going to have a stronger emotional response to something later on, that means that the part of us that's reacting to that emotional response, or that is having that emotional response, is actually a different part of us than has the emotional response in the moment. And so, the latter also requires that thus when Oh, thus, when a person has a different degree of impression to the same event in the long term, it is because the person's physiology for having impressions of past events is different than his physiology for present events, right? And so now, why would there be a now this is the question. Why would there be a different apparatus for acting upon the input of recent events than the input of less recent events? This is our next question we're trying to answer. And I'm almost done here, just bear with me. It would be useful to have a different apparatus. Okay, again, the apparatus being that which produces the feelings in us, because it may be useful to have different strengths of emotions depending on the proximity of an event, right? So think about this, right? This is why we would have different levels of emotional response to something, right? This is a possible reason. It's because it's actually useful for us to have these different strengths of emotional impressions over time. It is. Now, think of this. For example, a strong reaction to a present danger with weak reactions to already past dangers is very useful. A person with this temperament will both avoid anxiety and danger, right? So if you have a strong emotional response to danger in the present, you're going to be avoiding danger quite well. Then if you have a weaker impression of dangers in the past, you're not going to be as anxious. So that's useful, right? That's a very useful thing. But this does not only apply to the sanguine sort of person, which is the kind I described there. Because, for example, the sanguine person is going to have a problem delaying gratification. Because if you have a stronger, more immediate impression, you have a harder time delaying gratification. So if you have weaker immediate impressions, you have an easier time delaying gratification, but then you also aren't going to avoid danger as much, right? So there's those things to think about. Now, what this implies is what I said right near the beginning of the video, is that no one has a proper temperament. Meaning that if you trend towards any of the four temperaments that I said, because your physiology is remaining the same, because we laid out that it's your physiology, right? We explained that. And then we laid out that there's the different strengths in the short and long term. And we explained everything like that. And then I just explained that there's actually different times at which you need different strengths of impressions. So what this implies is that every single person is disordered, right? Because what we should have, like what a properly ordered person would have, is a strength of impression that is dependent upon the event at hand, right? And so you don't just need to have a bit of fear when a lion comes into your path, but you need to have the right amount of fear. And then you need to have the right amount of fear afterward, right? And so what this implies then is, and this is why people say that Christ did not have a temperament, right? So this is what people say, is that Christ did not have a temperament because Christ is perfect in his human, and divine nature as well, but in his human nature, he's perfect. He was a perfectly constructed human being, and therefore he didn't have a temperament because his physiology would have changed depending on the event at hand. He would have had the exact correct emotional response to whatever the event was. And so, that's just kind of interesting. Oh, and just as a brief note, you can't change your physiological structure by trying to change your cognition of events. That's not how it works. You might have a different cognition, which will give a different kind of emotional response, but you're not changing the strength of emotional response, right? So just by changing your cognition or the way you understand things isn't necessarily going to change your temperament. And so, I don't have any things of how you can change your temperament or become like Christ through your temperament, but I just thought this was pretty interesting. Maybe If you guys are interested, I could explore this topic a little further. It's a little complex. It gets a little thick at times. So yeah, anyway, that's going to be the end of the video. Next week, I'll probably try to do one on intelligence. No promises on that, though. Anyway, thanks for watching. Have a great week.